Good evening. Hi everybody. Welcome to the second virtual port tasting here, Churchill's port tasting. I've got with me my son James here this evening, who's helping coordinate this tasting, and he's going to transmit your messages and your questions to me.
Yeah, good afternoon, good evening everyone. Hope you're all well. So like Dad said, I'll be taking questions, so please fire away and we'll do our best to answer them. Thanks.
Okay. I'm actually repeating, I did this tasting last week, and because we've got a larger group of people joining us now, I'm repeating this tasting. We will be doing further tastings of other wines in the next 2 or 3 weeks. But for those of you who were here last week, welcome back. I'm going to talk to you as well about the challenge of producing Old Tawnies, and I've got with me a bottle. I know you guys haven't got it in your houses, but I got with me a bottle of our 30-year-old Tawny, which after we've tasted, I will explain a little bit about the challenges that there are in producing Old Tawny ports. Okay. I'm going to ask what I asked last week, is that could you please put your little bottles, if you haven't done so already, could you please put them in a deep freeze? If you have a deep freeze close at hand, just put these 3 little bottles in the deep freeze for the next 10 minutes, okay? During those 10 minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Churchills and a little bit about the style of wines that we produce and the philosophy behind the style. But if you could put those bottles now, when we start tasting, they should be at what I call cellar temperature, which is about 55 degrees centigrade, which is ideal for tasting port. Temperature is very important when you're drinking port or tasting port. I think most people tend to probably serve port at too high. They serve it at room temperature, which is a little bit too high. So if you remember, try and chill your ports a little bit, or keep them in the cellar before you serve them. It helps to focus the flavour, and particularly with port as a fortified wine, it restrains any tendency for the brandy to come out. Okay. I think the first thing I'd like to do, it's Her Majesty the Queen's birthday today, and so I'd like you to join me. I'm going to raise my glass and toast Her Majesty the Queen. God bless her. Let me talk a little bit about Churchills. My family have been involved, the Graham family have been involved in this business for the last 200 years. In fact, it was my great-great-grandfather who founded Grahamsport in 1820. We developed the business. I say we, it wasn't me, my ancestors developed the business, and they sold the company in 1970. I came out to Portugal in 1973 and learnt the trade. By that stage I was working with another company, and I married my wife Caroline Churchill in 1980, and shortly after that, in 1981, we founded Churchill Graham, Churchills. I founded Churchills because I wanted to create a style of port which I enjoyed and which I felt was the style that I'd like to show people. And it's obviously a style, it's quality, it's a distinctive style, but it's also an individual style. And I wanted to convey that style to the world, basically. The distinctive or the quality side of it, I decided that all my ports were going to be produced from what we call grade A vineyards. Now, in the Douro, vineyards are classified from A to E depending on quality, A being the best, E being the least good. Okay, and vintage port really only comes from grade A vineyards. So all our grapes are grade A grapes with therefore potential for making vintage port, and all our ports come from those grapes. Okay. So in terms of quality, I can guarantee that we're right up there in terms of the raw material. In terms of individuality, one of the key influencing factors is the vineyard that we bought 20 years ago. In 1999, we bought Quinta de Grisha. Now, Quinta de Grisha is a 50-hectare vineyard situated on the south bank of the River Douro in the Cima Corgo subsection, okay, which lies upriver from Pignon, between Pignon and Tours. There are two important factors about Quinta de Grisha. One is it has very much a mineral style of soil. I mean, it was the site of wolfram mines for the last 100 years, and so there's a lot of minerality coming out of the soil. It's mainly schistous soil, but with quite a lot of quartz. Okay, and then the other factor which is fundamental is that being situated on the south bank of the Douro, it faces north, which means that it has a much fresher, cooler aspect. And I particularly wanted this because, as a result, I wanted to produce. The Douro is a very hot region, and I wanted to make sure that I had a vineyard which produced very aromatic wines and wines with great natural acidity. And that really is very much the contributing factor of Quinta de Grisha. Quinta de Grisha influences all our ports. All the ports that we make come from Quinta de Grisha, which is a grade A vineyard, as are the other grade A vineyards with which we have a relationship with. We deal with about another 12 vineyards in the area. And so these grapes are brought in. We only make our ports in the winery at Quinta de Grisha. Now, hopefully all of you will be able to visit Quinta de Grisha. It is open to the public. It's a fabulous spot, and situated with a fabulous view over the Douro. And we inherited the most beautiful granite lagars. Lagars are granite tanks, which are the traditional way of making port. And we inherited these granite tanks with the property, and all our ports are made by foot treading in these granite tanks. Now, we don't do that just for folkloric reasons, although it's great fun to be part of the vintage when the people are treading. But it's not just purely for folklore, it's also because actually treading is one of the best ways of vinifying quality ports, particularly vintage ports, to extract the colour, and you get the maceration that you require, but you get a gentle maceration. You don't have the risk of damaging the pips and getting those bitter elements from the pips, which you might do if you use mechanical means. So, in my opinion, treading is still an extremely effective way of vinification, particularly for top quality ports. So in terms of, let's say, the individuality, we get the individuality from Quinta de Grisha, but we also get a certain amount of the individuality from our winemaking procedures. We only use natural yeast. We don't use cultured yeast for making port. We only use natural yeast, which come off the grapes themselves, okay, in the vineyard. And the natural yeasts tend to produce a slower fermentation and a more natural fermentation at a lower temperature, okay? And that preserves the aromatics and the flavours in the ports. The other important aspect from the vinification point of view is we tend to use minimal intervention. We try not to intervene, we intervene as little as possible in the winemaking process. But what we do like is to prolong the fermentation. We prolong the fermentation to actually get as much natural alcohol from the wine, from the grapes themselves, from the sugar in the grapes. As you know, fermentation is fermenting the sugar into alcohol. So we rely very much on getting our alcohol from the natural sugar in the grapes. And as a result, we actually use a much smaller quantity of fortification spirit, of brandy. And I believe this produces a more natural wine, produces a more natural port that is better structured and better balanced, okay? And really those factors are important in defining the style of Churchills, the style that I wanted to convey. And that is a style of port that is very well structured, but with excellent natural acidity and elegance. When I say natural acidity is fundamental in any wine or port. It provides longevity. It means that a port is able to age, and particularly with our vintage ports, we want to have that potential, because at the end of the day, we want to make a vintage port that is going to age for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, even maybe 100 years. But we also want to produce ports that are elegant. And it also, natural acidity brings that elegance to the port. And for me, that's very important in my winemaking techniques. Let's get down to tasting, okay? We're going to start with the white port. And this is an aperitif. This is a dry white port. The grape variety, principal grape variety, comes from a variety called Malvasia fina. And Malvasia fina is a grape variety which was often planted in a lot of the traditional grade A vineyards, because the white grapes help to cross-pollinate. And so what farmers tended to do was that every 100 yards in a row, they would plant a white grape variety for those purposes. So most grade A quintas, most grade A vineyards will have a small quantity of white grapes, and it's those white grapes that we use principally for making our white port. And we vinify our white port, like the red ports, we vinify them in the lagars, in those granite tanks at Quinta de Grisha, the granite lagars, and we use foot treading. We obviously don't macerate. We don't need to macerate the white grapes as much as we would for the red, because we're not worried particularly about extracting colour in the white port. In fact, the colour that you see here, this lovely golden colour, tends to come from the aging in barrel that we give this port after we've made it. With our white port, we tend to age it for almost 10 years in barrel, hence this lovely golden colour. Sorry, one point which I didn't mention is that we tend to vinify this almost dry. So this is what we call a dry white port, and so therefore it's very suitable to drink as an aperitif. Although a lot of people like drinking it, they feel it's lighter, and they drink it actually after, with dessert as well. But as an aperitif, it's delicious with either salted almonds before lunch or dinner. It goes very well with other starters like pâtés, delicious with pâtés, chicken liver pâté or even fish pâtés. And it actually goes well with something like sushi. So it's very adaptable. Although I told you that you should serve this at a maximum of 12 degrees centigrade, 55 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what I call cellar temperature. But with the white port, you can actually keep it colder. You can actually keep it in the fridge, in your commercial fridge at home. Just keep the bottle in the fridge and serve it straight out of the fridge. That means that the port actually, when you drink it at that temperature, it'll be about 8 to 10 degrees centigrade. Sorry, I'm thinking in centigrade. So it's about 50 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a good temperature. It's good to have it slightly chilled because, again, it helps to focus the flavour. When you taste it, you'll notice the aroma has a touch of almost orange blossom flavour on the aroma. But it's got a good body. I mean, these were, on the whole, most of the vines that go into making the white port are quite old vines and they have good structure. And combine that with the fact that it's been made in treading tanks means the port has good structure. And it has that lovely natural acidity that I hope all our ports, you'll see in all our ports, which gives balance and elegance to the port. Okay. Now my son James is also particularly fond of making a cocktail from this port, we do a white port and tonic cocktail, which actually he's going to be later in, I think in May, isn't it, James? He's going to be doing a special talk, a special tasting to show modern ways of using port, particularly with the white port and with the Tawnies, but also with young vintages, okay? But just so that you know, I mean, I love this port straight from the fridge as an aperitif. Personally, I think it's delicious and it's very difficult to stop drinking another glass, quite frankly. That's the problem. But if you want to make a cocktail, which again is very refreshing, use 1 measure of white port, Churchill's white port, and 1 measure of tonic of your choice, okay? On the rocks with a twist of orange peel, okay? It's as simple as that. So it's 50-50, Churchill's white port, tonic water, on the rocks with a twist of orange peel. It's a very refreshing drink. And even me as a sort of old fuddy-duddy, I think it's very, I've come completely round to it and I really do think it's delicious. Good. Any questions? If there are any questions, please send in questions and James will transmit them to me. Okay, let's go on to the second. Port. Sorry, I've got these the wrong way around. Let's go on to the second port that we're tasting, which is our reserve port. Now, reserve port is a ruby port, and as you can see from the colour, this is a ruby colour, which is a young port of average of about 3 to 4 years old. Now, we call it reserve because at Churchill's, as I said to you before, all our ports are made from grade A grapes. So this is a sort of Rolls Royce of the rubies. This is a port that has had vintage port treatment during the care it's received since we received the grapes in our winery at Quinta de Grisha, the treading and the aftercare that it's had. As I say, we've treated it like a vintage. And let me just add one thing. When the grapes come in to our winery at Quinta de Grisha, they're all grade A. We genuinely don't know, when those grapes come in, we don't know at that stage whether they're going to be producing vintage port, LBV port, or reserve port. That is a selection that I make with my colleague Ricardo, my tasting colleague Ricardo Nunes, and fellow director who's let's say on my tasting panel, and we then taste these wines blind. We taste these ports blind after the vintage, and we classify them into this simple tree: vintage, LBV, reserve, or ruby reserve. Okay, so this ruby reserve would have come from grade A grapes. It would have had vintage port treatment. The only reason it wasn't classified for vintage port is that possibly the port would have been slightly less intense. There wouldn't have been quite the intensity of the ports that we would have separated for LBV or vintage, okay? But the intrinsic quality would be the same. And so when I said this is a Rolls Royce of rubies, I mean that. And when the aroma, I think you can tell straight away, when you nose this port, it's got a very there's a purity here of fruit. And I think that's something I hope you'll see in all Churchill's ports. there's really a purity of fruit. There's a pedigree, about this, and the flavour as well is there. It's balanced. I hope you'll agree with me. It's balanced. It's got excellent freshness, which is what I was telling you earlier. Very much the influence of the Quinta da Grisha vineyard comes into this, that freshness that it's got. And it finishes with good acidity. And so it closes well, and it means that means that you get a good balance, okay? Now this is a delicious port to serve on its own after dinner, but it'll also go very well with a cheese. If you serve this with a Stilton or a cheddar. My preference tends to be I like Stilton with I like to have Stilton with the heavier wines like the vintage and LBVs and reserve, because it falls into that category, and the cheddars I find tend to go better with the Tawnies, the 10, 20 and 30-year-old Tawnies. But that's my preference. But cheese on the whole, port goes extremely well with cheese. It also goes well with certain desserts. I mean, the reserve port you could have with a chocolate dessert. You could have a chocolate mousse, and especially if it's served quite cold, because you have the contrast of the warm chocolate mousse with the cold reserve port. It's a very good mixture. But it also goes well with other desserts. I mean, it'll go well with fruit base. You can have it with apple crumble, something like that. So it is quite versatile in that way. Good.
We have a couple of questions
Yep.
which have come in. So from Elizabeth Hack, asking you, what is special about your crusted port? I know we don't have it here to taste today, but could you...
It's special, Elizabeth, because going back to my tree, the basic tree, with crusted port, it rather like the 20 and the 30-year-old Tawny, which I'm going to talk about soon, it comes out of the top tier. So it basically, the intrinsic quality of crusted port comes from a vintage quality grape, okay, and a vintage quality selection. It's then just the way that we treat it after that. And crusted port has a bottling. It doesn't have the year of the vintage. It tends to be a blend of 2 years. In Churchill's case, it's a blend of 2 years, and it carries the bottling date on the bottle. So you will see Churchill's bottled crusted port bottle 2006, let's say. Now we put the bottling date because the whole idea of a crusted port is that it'll gain that mature vintage character that a vintage port gains when it matures in bottle. So the whole idea of a crusted port is to age it in bottle after it's been bottled. And we tend to store it in our cellars in bottle before we sell it. We normally store it for between 2 to 5 years or even longer sometimes, and it's lying down in bin, and then when we have an order, we bottle it, we put it lying down in cases, and it gets sent to the customer. And it should be maintained lying down. And as I say, it's a delicious, at a fraction of the price of vintage, you get very much the vintage flavour, okay?
And we've got one question from Charlie, asking you, will you make white port from vineyards from other than Grisha?
From what?
Other than Grisha, will you make white port from vineyards other than Grisha?
Yes, sorry, I didn't, when I said we tend to use the white port grapes in grade A vineyards predominantly. So we use Malvasia fina grapes, but as I said to you, I think I said earlier, most grade A vineyards, traditional grade A vineyards, tend to plant a small quantity of white vines, of white grape vines, to help with cross-pollination. So there's all these vineyards that we deal with, apart from Grisha, they also have, they're also sources of white port for us. Okay.
And now whilst we're on a roll with the questions, we've got a question from Charles Hamby, asking you, would it be sacrilege to drink a vintage port early? Is it possible to drink a port too early?
Well, it's subjective, isn't it? It's up to you, I think. I mean, it depends on what you personally want to get out of it. I mean, I can understand that people like to drink young vintage ports because they are brimming with fruit, and they're very powerful. They're very well structured, and they're overpowering. But they're a delight. But they're also a delight if you have the chance. You know, I'm sure you have. If you've drunk a vintage port that's 50 years old, it's very special, and you know it's definitely worth waiting if you can. But it's up to you really. You can do whatever. I'm not here to influence you. If you like to drink young vintage ports, you can. I don't think you can ever say that you drink a port too young. It's rather like saying it's the same with a wine. You know, I mean, it depends on how you like to drink them. I personally, my own preference is I like to have age, but that's because I feel you get a different dimension. The aging gives the port a different dimension. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, you make ports to age.
I make ports to age. That's the way I do it. But I don't. Let's say, I'm not preventing anybody from opening one of my vintage ports when it's young. I mean, you can. The 2011 is tasting delicious right now. I mean, it's all a question of degree, you know. But the 2011 will be a vintage that will go on for 100 years. It'll be fabulous. It's an iconic style of vintage. Very similar. The 17 is another example. 2017, which is our last vintage, is it's a fabulous vintage. It's got marvelous tannin, fabulous fruit. It's lovely to drink now. I mean, you can drink it, but it's not the way I like to appreciate it. I'd rather age it. Okay. Sorry.
No, perfect. We've got a couple more questions. So one from Mark White. Will Churchills produce a 40-year-old Tawny?
We will.
Or culetas?
We will. When it's, it'll be our 40th birthday coming up in next year, actually in 2021. And so our intention is to launch a 40-year-old soon thereafter, either next year or soon thereafter. Okay, it's in the pipeline. And if I talk a little bit now about, maybe it's the time that I haven't yet done the 10-year-old. Sorry, that first. Taste the 10-year-old. How are we doing time-wise?
No, it's absolutely fine. Yeah, if we move on to the 10.
Okay, because I'd like to talk a little bit about the challenges of producing old Tawnies, and I can include that in the 40-year-old that we're making. Okay, now, the last port that you've got in your little bottles is the 10-year-old Tawny. Okay, Tawny ports officially are, we're allowed to sell them as either Tawny. We don't produce a young Tawny for reasons I won't go into now, but to be honest, the youngest Tawny we produce is the 10-year-old Tawny. And a Tawny port is aged obviously in barrel. I mean, this is as opposed to being aged in bottle. So our Tawny ports come from ruby or very serious ruby ports to start with. And as I was saying to you before, we don't try and make a 10-year-old Tawny right from the grapes from the start. What we're trying to do is to get the best out of the grapes that we get. So we try and make vintage with everything. Okay, and that's the way we feel we can best maximize the quality of the grapes that we get in. And then from our tree, depending on the level of quality, we decide whether the Tawny port is going to come out of the top level, the middle level, or the bottom level. And the reason we don't do a Tawny port is at the moment we haven't got round to doing a bottom level, let's say Tawny out of the reserve port. Maybe we will do in the future, but at the moment, the only Tawny, the youngest Tawny we do is the 10-year-old Tawny, which comes out of the LBV level, okay? And in fact, what I feel is important about Tawny port is that I don't want the wood to dominate the fruit element. I think it's very important that the wood shouldn't dominate the fruit, because otherwise you end up with a very boring, rather lifeless type of port. The whole idea is to keep it alive and to keep it fresh. So Tawny ports, when we talk about a 10-year-old or 20 or 30 or 40, we're talking about an average age. Okay, that's an average age. But you've got to keep that tawny port alive in barrel. It takes a lot of looking after. When you're making a tawny port, it requires much more maintenance than making a vintage port. A vintage port, the taster blender has to get it right at the beginning. He's got to have the right source of grapes to be able to produce that classic, the best vintage blend that he can. But once he's done that, the vintage is shortly after that is bottled, and then it ages in bottle, and he basically has, he's shot his bolt, and then it's up, it ages in bottle. He can't interfere with it. However, with a tawny port, the same tawny that goes into that vintage, some of it will be reserved for 30 or 40-year-old, and the blender taster has to look after that port during its lifetime. And so every year that port has to be, we'd say, taking it off the lees, taking off its sediment. It has to be refreshed. So we give it a little bit of younger port just to kick it into life. And this refreshment is very important because that's really what makes an old tawny so appealing and so nice. I mean, I once had a gentleman who came up to me. I was traveling, I was on a sales trip, and he came up to me and he said, "Mr. Graham, I've got a bottle of your 10-year-old, which I've kept in my cellar for 10 years in bottle. Does that make it a 20-year-old? And I said, yes, it actually is 20 years old, but it's not refreshed, it'll be stale. You haven't, the whole idea of a tawny port is when it's bottled, it should be drunk quite quickly. It's been prepared, it's been refreshed during its life in barrel. It's been refreshed so that when it's bottled and when you buy it, it's ideal to drink. If you age it, all it's going to do is you're going to take that freshness away, and you'll end up with, yes, a 20-year-old, very stale 10-year-old port, okay?
Yeah, in terms of also the average ages, you said the other day that you prefer to take, you don't like refreshing extremes.
The laws of blending, I mean, absolutely. I don't know how many people have actually, I was fortunate because I understudied a great man who was not only a great man in the dairy, but a great taster, a chap called John Smithers, who's sadly not with us now. But I was fortunate enough to be able to understudy him. And there were the do's and don'ts of tasting, and one of the don'ts is that you don't blend extremes. So if you're trying to make a 10-year-old tawny, you don't get a 20-year-old tawny and blend it with a 1-year-old young port. It just doesn't work. What you do is you just refresh your 10-year-old. As your 10-year-old becomes 11 years old, you then give it a little bit of the 9-year-old. And we have reserves. Each of these tawnies have what I call a pyramid of reserves underneath. You have the lot at the top, and underneath there is a pyramid of reserves. All those reserves have to be refreshed themselves. Otherwise, the whole thing doesn't work. So you've got to refresh the reserves to then refresh the lot. So a lot of work goes on in producing old tawnies, and much more than people realize. I think a lot of the work that we do in the lodge on a day-to-day basis is that sort of blending work that goes on. We're refreshing younger reserves that will go into this port, so that when we have to increase the quantity of the lot, we have fresh reserves that we use to blend in to the lot itself. Okay, and sorry, that's part of the discussion that I was going to give you, and it's obviously even more important when you're producing older tawnies, because this question of freshness is very important. Because if you just leave a port and leave it for 20 years, you're just going to have a very stale 20-year-old tawny port. And so it is a constant job of refreshing these, and it requires a lot of work. So sometimes people say, well, what's better, a tawny or a vintage? They're both basically the best tawny comes out of the same level as the best. Sorry, did I say best tawny? The best tawny comes out of the same level as the best vintage. They're just different ways. They've been maintained in different ways. and a lot more work goes into maintaining that Tawny than the vintage, okay?
Just before we move on to the 30-year-old, we've got a couple more questions for you to answer.
Yep.
So another one from Elizabeth Hack asking you about the vintage port. What favourite vintage port since 2000 can you recommend? It's got to be the 11 and the 17, surely.
Well, those are the two that I think are fabulous, personally. But there are, they all have their, it's like telling which children you prefer. I mean, the 2003 was a hot year, but it's concentrated. It's drinking, it's still young, but it's beginning to drink quite well. But it's a year that will go on. The 2007 is a very much a quality year. It hasn't quite got the power of the 11 or the 3, but it's a lovely wine. It's very distinguished. It'll be a port that will age well. It might not be iconic like the 11, but it'll age very well. And I love the 17. I mean, it's not just because it's the last vintage, but I really do think it has that combination of what I like, which is those harder tannins with lovely fruit. And you when you have that combination of fabulous fruit with those harder tannins, you know that you're onto a good thing. Okay.
Okay, another question from Ethan asking, how is the 10, 20, 30, 40 defined by regulation or practice? Is there a precise formula, or is it subject to judgment of winemaker how to classify?
It's subject, we submit, when we want to register a 10-year-old Tawny or a 20 or 30 or 40-year-old, we submit samples to the official tasting panel at the IVDP, okay? And they will taste, they will analyze our ports, and they will give a blind tasting, and they will either say yes or they'll say no. And if they say no, we have the right to appeal. And then we can appeal, and then we can go in person and taste the wine with the panel, and come to a decision whether we then decide whether they're right or we're right. Okay.
Okay, and another question from Martin: is the 1985 vintage ready to drink now?
Yes, it is, but it will go on aging. I mean, this is the whole thing with vintage ports. Vintage ports. Good vintage ports, in my opinion, really, you should wait for something like 30 years. Now, what are we talking about? The 85, 95, 2005. The 85 is 33 years old, is that right, James? Is your maths better than mine? I think it's 33 years old. So it's right in that drinking, so yes, it's perfect for drinking, but to be honest, and I drank a bottle not so long ago, it's still got a long way to go, and it will carry on improving.
The 85.
The 85, yeah.
Yeah, you say with an emblematic year like that.
Yeah, there's a freshness and there's the fruit there. It'll go on aging. Okay. Good. Well, I'm sorry. You guys haven't got the 30-year-old with you. So let me just. I've pretty much talked about how the challenge of aging Tawnies, and as I say, the fundamental thing is this freshness and keeping the ports fresh. And as I say, I was lucky enough to understudy John Smithies, who was a legend in his time, and not only as somebody who was very knowledgeable about the Douro and the vineyard side, but from the tasting point of view. And I was lucky because I was able to get the sort of inside track into, as I say, the do's and don'ts of blending, which is something that most people don't have access to these days. Most people learn things from books, and I was fortunate because I had the great man himself actually tasting with me, and I spent 8 years of my life, of my apprentice years, learning with him. And I'm very fussy, particularly about Tawnies. I can't drink. It has, to me, a Tawny has to have the wood can't dominate the fruit, and there has to be freshness. There has to be natural acidity to give it elegance, and those are fundamental. Okay, and the older the port, as I said, this is the 30-year-old. As you can see now, it's already this has really got a brick red colour to it already, but it's still there's still quite a lot of deep fruit colour there with it as well, which is what I like. As I said earlier, we're actually in the process now of making a 40-year-old Tawny, which will be released either next year or shortly afterwards to celebrate our 40th anniversary. It's hard to believe that it's already been 40 years. Amazing. Anyway,
we've got a couple more questions,
okay.
if you don't mind answering them as well. So one from Ed Burnett, asking you the best vintage port you've ever had. You can pick a couple.
Well, I can tell you straight away the best vintage port I've ever had was at Coburn's 1947. Edward, hi. Something that really stayed with me for many years. Coburn's 1947 was a very special port, and still beautifully fresh, lovely port. Not easy to get hold of, but really special.
Was that a full vintage year?
That was. It was. I think no. It wasn't a generally declared vintage year. 48 was more generally declared, but I think it was declared by a number of houses. The ones I remember were Coburn's. I think Delaforce's declared 47. I think. But the Coburn's 47 was a particularly lovely port that I remember in the past, that I've always loved. And I love we talked about the 85. I personally love my 85. My Churchill's 85 is a port that's now ready to drink. I think it's very special. Okay.
Another question, you do not use the official port wine glasses?
Well, I like bigger wine glasses. I like to have wines that I'm swilling round, and I like to be able to swill. I find that the official ones, they're fine for tasting in, but we're in a sort of tasting drinking environment here, and certainly here at home, I tend not to use tasting glasses here at home. I prefer using a glass that has a slightly more generous aperture at the top. Okay.
You designed those, didn't you?
Not these.
Okay.
No, not these. No, we have some glasses that we designed but they're slightly smaller, and they're lovely. They're a tulip-shaped glass for drinking port. Good. Well, I don't know if there are any more questions, but thank you for bearing with me, and please keep safe, and don't get too bored being stuck at home. But I think it's important to do so, and keep drinking good vintage ports and good Tawny ports, and whatever port you've got in your cellar, as long as it's Churchills, preferably Churchills, but keep drinking port. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Just to add that we are going to be uploading different stockists where you can buy our ports